Before we begin, tell us which city you're watching from and what time it is there right now. In 1896, in the small village of Thornbury, Gloucestershire, England, a man disappeared without a trace. There were no screams, there was no blood, there was no body, just an empty chair at a table set for dinner, and one witness, a single witness, a 9-year-old boy who swore he saw everything. For 12 years he repeated the same story, word for word, with almost disturbing precision, until, in 1908, he changed everything. His name was Thomas Edward Hargrave, 43 years old, carpenter, widower, father of 2. Parish records describe him as a quiet man with rough hands and a distant gaze, someone who spoke little but was respected, someone who never missed work, someone who, according to his neighbors, was not given to fantasies. He lived in a small stone house at the end of Church Lane, where the wind from the open fields made the windows rattle at night. The house still stands. It has been abandoned for decades. The floorboards creak under the weight of time. But if you close your eyes, you can still hear the echo of a life that was cut short without warning. Thomas lived there with his 2 sons, Arthur, 12, and William, the youngest, 9. Their mother, Eleanor, had died 3 years earlier during a harsh winter, pneumonia. The medical records are brief, cold, as they used to be. Since then, Thomas had raised the boys alone. He worked from sunrise to sunset. He taught Arthur his trade. He prepared meals. He kept the house in order. He didn't complain. He didn't ask for help. He was the kind of man the times demanded. Thornbury was a village of just over 1,500 souls. Narrow streets, stone houses, fields stretching as far as the eye could see. A church, a tavern, a school, a butcher shop, a blacksmith's workshop. The kind of place where everyone knew each other, where secrets were whispered but never forgotten, where time seemed to pass more slowly than in the rest of the world. The nights were dark. There was no electric light, only oil lamps, and the occasional glow of the moon. When the wind blew hard, the flames flickered behind the windows, casting shadows that danced on the walls. The winters were long, the summers were short, and autumn brought a thick fog that rose from the fields and enveloped the houses like a gray, damp blanket. It was on one of those autumn nights that Thomas Hargrave disappeared. October 28, 1896, Tuesday. According to records, Thomas worked all day in the carpentry workshop outside the village. He was building a bookcase for the Ashford family who lived 3 kilometers away. The job was almost done. At 5:30 p.m., he put away his tools and walked home. He always took the same route, along the path beside the church, past the cemetery, through the alley that led to Church Lane. 2 people saw him on that route, Mrs. Pemberton, who was sweeping the entrance to her house, and the young milkman, Henry Cross, who was pushing an empty cart back to the barn. Both later confirmed that Thomas seemed normal, quiet as always. He didn't greet anyone, but that was not unusual. He arrived home around 6 o'clock. There was still light in the sky, but it was faint. The kind of light that dies slowly, without fanfare. Arthur, the eldest son, was lighting the fireplace. William, the youngest, was already sitting at the table waiting for dinner. Thomas took off his coat. He hung it on the wooden hook next to the door. He washed his hands in the basin of cold water that Arthur had prepared. Then he sat down at the table. That was the last time anyone other than William saw him. Official documents on the case are scarce, but they do exist. They are stored in the Gloucestershire County Archives, in cardboard boxes stained by moisture. Letters, police reports, handwritten statements with faded ink, and there is something strange. In William's first statement, made 2 days after the disappearance, there is a sentence that has been underlined 3 times. It is not known who made the marks, whether it was the sheriff, whether it was the clerk, whether it was someone years later reviewing the case. But the sentence is there, clear, disturbing. He walked out the door, but he didn't open the door. William was 9 years old when he said that. And he repeated the same sentence for the next 12 years, until in 1908 he decided to tell a different story. And everything we thought we knew about that night fell apart. To understand what happened that night, We need to go back in time a little. We need to know who Thomas Hargrave was, who his children were, what their lives were like before everything fell apart. Parish records show that Thomas and Eleanor were married in 1882. She was 19. He was 29. The ceremony was simple. Few witnesses, a cotton dress, a bouquet of wildflowers picked from the roadside. Eleanor was the daughter of a miller. Thomas was the son of a carpenter. Neither came from wealthy families, but they were hard-working, honest, the kind of people the village respected. Arthur was born the following year. William, 3 years later. Eleanor took care of the house. Thomas worked in the carpentry shop he had inherited from his father. Life was hard, but it wasn't unhappy. There was bread on the table. There was a fire in the hearth. There was quiet laughter on Sunday evenings when the family gathered around the table for dinner. But in 1893, Eleanor fell ill. It was quick, brutal. She started coughing in early December. By Christmas Day, she could barely get out of bed. By the 31st, she was dead. Thomas didn't cry at the funeral, at least not in front of others. But the neighbors say he was never the same again. He started working even harder. He woke up before sunrise. He came home when it was already dark. Arthur took on some of the responsibilities. He cooked, he cleaned, he took care of William. He was only 9 at the time, but he learned quickly. He had to learn. William, on the other hand, was quiet, introspective. He would spend hours sitting by the window looking out at the fields. His teachers said he was intelligent, but distant, as if he were always thinking about something else. Thomas rarely spoke about Eleanor, not out of anger, not out of sadness, simply because he didn't know how. He kept everything inside, like so many men of that era, like so many men of any era. In the 3 years following Eleanor's death, the Hargrave family's routine became mechanical, predictable. Thomas woke up at 5 in the morning. He made coffee. He woke the boys up. He left for work. Arthur went to school. William too. In the afternoon, Arthur helped his father in the workshop. William would return home alone. He would stay there, reading or drawing until the other two arrived. Then they would have dinner, in silence most of the time. Then they would go to sleep, and the next day, everything would repeat itself. The neighbors said that Thomas was a good father, that he did the best he could, but there was something melancholic about that house, something that people felt, but couldn't name. Mrs. Pemberton, who lived 2 houses down, described it years later in a letter to the local newspaper. She said that whenever she passed the Hargrave house, she had the feeling that time moved more slowly inside, as if that family were stuck somewhere between the past and the present. And maybe they were. In the weeks leading up to the disappearance, some details began to stand out. Small things, nothing that caught anyone's attention at the time, but later, they seemed like signs. The village blacksmith, a man named George Talbot, remembered seeing Thomas standing in front of the workshop staring at the road. That was in early October. George asked if everything was okay. Thomas didn't answer. He just nodded and kept walking. William's teacher, Miss Carter, noticed that the boy was even quieter than usual. She wrote this in her diary, which has been preserved by the family. On October 23rd, 5 days before the disappearance, she wrote down something that seemed irrelevant at the time. William had drawn a house, his house, but at the door there was a shadow, a tall figure, faceless. When she asked who it was, William said he didn't know, that it just appeared in the drawing, and there was Arthur, the eldest son, the boy who was growing up too fast. He started sleeping poorly. He would wake up in the middle of the night. Neighbors heard screams coming from the Hargrave house on at least 2 occasions. Screams of a child, frightened. Thomas explained that Arthur was having nightmares, that it was normal, that it would pass, and that was it. No one asked any more questions, but there was something no one knew, something that would only come to light years later, when William finally decided to speak up. In the last few weeks before his disappearance, Thomas began to act strangely. Not in an obvious way, not in a way that would alarm his children, but he started locking the front door every night, something he never did before. He started checking the windows, looking outside before turning off the lamps. And on more than one occasion, William saw him standing in the hallway in the middle of the night, staring at the front door, as if waiting for someone to come in. But no one ever came in. On the night of October 28th, everything seemed normal, or almost. Thomas came home at the usual time. He washed his hands. He sat down at the table. Arthur served dinner: bread, vegetable soup, a piece of cheese. Thomas ate in silence. So did William. Arthur tried to start a conversation, but gave up after a few words. The silence in that house was not uncomfortable. It was just silence. After dinner, Arthur went out to get more firewood. He was gone for about 15 minutes. When he returned, Thomas was still sitting at the table. But something was different. He was staring at the door, intently, as if he had heard something. Arthur asked him what it was. Thomas didn't answer. He just shook his head and got up. He said he was going to bed. He wished the boys good night, and he went upstairs. William was left alone in the kitchen, or at least, that's what he thought. Arthur went up to his room right after his father. He was tired. It had been a long day. He slept in the same room as William, in 2 narrow beds, less than a meter apart. The room was small, cold. The floorboards creaked with every step. There was a single window facing the fields. That night the curtain was closed. William stayed in the kitchen for a few more minutes, sitting at the table, staring at the flame of the lamp, which flickered slightly with the draft coming in under the door. He could hear the wind outside, a low wind, persistent, the kind of wind that seems to whisper something you can't understand. He got up, he turned off the lamp, and he went upstairs. The upstairs hallway was narrow, dark. There were 3 doors: Thomas's bedroom door, the boys' bedroom door, and the door to the small storage room where they kept old clothes and broken tools. William passed his father's bedroom door. It was closed. There was no light under it. Everything was silent. He went into his own room. Arthur was already lying down, with his back to the door, breathing deeply, sleeping or pretending to sleep. William was never sure. He took off his boots, put on his nightshirt, lay down, pulled the blanket up to his chin, and lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind, listening to the creaking of the wood, listening to the heavy silence that filled that house like a thick liquid. He doesn't know how much time passed. Maybe half an hour, maybe more. But at some point, he heard a sound, coming from below, from the kitchen, a muffled sound, like the scraping of a chair, or bare feet on the stone floor. William got up, slowly, without making a sound. Arthur didn't move. He walked to the door. He opened it just enough to peek out. The hallway was dark, but downstairs, coming from the kitchen, there was a faint light, orange, as if someone had lit the lamp again. He went down the stairs, step by step, holding onto the worn wooden handrail, his heart pounding in his chest, not out of fear, but because of something he couldn't name, a feeling that something was out of place, that the air was different, denser, colder. When he reached the last step, he stopped and looked. His father was in the kitchen, standing, with his back to the stairs, standing in front of the front door. The lamp was lit on the table. The light cast Thomas's shadow on the wall, a long shadow, motionless. He didn't move. He didn't make a sound. He just stood there, looking at the door. William took a step forward. The floorboard creaked. Thomas didn't turn around. He didn't react. William opened his mouth to say something, but the words didn't come out. Something was wrong. Something about his father's posture, the way he kept his shoulders tense, the way his hands were clenched at his sides. And then William heard it, a sound coming from outside, from the other side of the door. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was a low sound, continuous, like a murmur, as if someone were whispering something on the other side of the wood. But the words weren't clear. They were just sounds, drawn-out syllables, meaningless. Thomas took a step forward, slowly. William felt his blood run cold. He wanted to scream. He wanted to run. He wanted to wake Arthur, but he couldn't move. He was stuck there, watching. His father reached out toward the door. His fingers approached the wood. And then William saw something that would mark the rest of his life, something he would describe dozens of times in the years to come. always in the same way, always with the same words. Thomas didn't touch the door. He simply walked through it. There was no sound. There was no sudden movement. There was no light. He just took another step forward and disappeared, as if the door wasn't there, as if it were made of air, as if the world had opened up for a second and swallowed him. William stood there, still, staring at the closed door, at the shadow of his father that was still projected on the wall, but which began to fade little by little, until it disappeared completely. He didn't scream, he didn't cry, he just stood there, breathing, trying to understand what he had just seen, trying to find an explanation, any explanation. But there wasn't one. There was only silence, and the door, and the lamp that was still lit on the table. He walked to the door, slowly, his legs trembling. He put his hand on the wood. It was cold, solid, real. He tried to open it. The lock was closed. From the inside, as always, he unlocked it, opened the door, and looked outside. There was nothing, only the darkness of the night, the low fog that covered the fields, the wind that carried the smell of damp earth. No trace, no sound of footsteps, no sign that anyone had passed by. William closed the door, locked it again, and stood there, in the middle of the kitchen, alone, with the feeling that something fundamental in the world had been broken, that an invisible law had been violated, that reality for a brief moment had ceased to make sense. He didn't go back to his room. He didn't try to wake Arthur. He just sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, and waited. He waited for dawn. He waited for his father to return. He waited for it all to be just a nightmare. But Thomas Hargrave never came back. When the sun rose, Arthur went downstairs and found William there, sitting on the floor, staring into space. He asked where his father was. William didn't answer right away. He just looked at his brother, and then, with a trembling voice, he said the words that would become the center of a mystery that would last for decades. He walked out the door, but he didn't open the door. Arthur didn't understand. No one understood. And for the next 12 years, William would repeat that phrase whenever he was asked. Always in the same way, always with the same conviction. He had seen it. He knew. His father had disappeared through a closed door. Impossible. Illogical. But real. At least that's what he believed. Until 1908. News of Thomas Hargrave's disappearance spread through the village before noon. Arthur ran to Mrs. Pemberton's house. She called the blacksmith. The blacksmith called the pastor. The pastor called the sheriff. Within hours, half of Thornbury was gathered around the small stone house at the end of Church Lane. The sheriff's name was Robert Finch, a middle-aged man, grey mustache, firm posture. He had dealt with disappearances before, but never like this one. Never with a witness who claimed to have seen what William said he had seen. He questioned the boy in his own kitchen, sitting at the table, with Arthur beside him. William answered every question calmly, without hesitation, without changing the details. He described everything, the way his father stood in front of the door, the sound coming from outside, the low, incomprehensible murmur, and then the moment when Thomas simply walked through the wood and disappeared. Finch listened to everything. He wrote everything down, but he didn't believe it. How could he? He checked the door. It was intact, solid. No marks, no signs of forced entry. The lock was on the inside, exactly as William had described. He checked the windows, all closed, also from the inside. He checked the ground. There were no footprints leading out of the house. There were no signs of a struggle. There was no blood. He organized a search. Dozens of men combed the fields around the village. They scoured the roads. They searched the abandoned barns. They dragged the small stream that ran through the Ashford property. But they found nothing. No trace. No clue. No body. Thomas Hargrave had simply ceased to exist. In the days that followed, theories began to emerge. Some people believed that Thomas had run away, that widowerhood had become too much for him, that he had abandoned his children and left for another town. But that didn't make sense. Thomas had no money, he had no motive, and above all, he wasn't the kind of man who would run away. Others believed he had been murdered, that someone had broken into the house during the night, that they had taken the body, that they had covered their tracks. But how? The doors were locked from the inside, the windows too, and there were no signs of violence, no sound, no scream. William would have heard it. And then there were those who believed William, or at least pretended to believe him. Those who whispered in taverns and churches about things that couldn't be explained, about ancient phenomena, about doors that led nowhere, about men who disappeared without warning. But these conversations were always interrupted, always avoided, because no one wanted to admit they believed in such things. William was questioned 3 more times in the following months, always by Deputy Finch, always with the same questions, and always with the same answers, word for word, without variation, as if he were reciting something memorized. But he wasn't. He was simply telling what he had seen, what he had experienced, what he couldn't forget. Arthur, on the other hand, saw nothing. He was asleep, or at least that's what he said. But there was something in his eyes, something the deputy noticed, a hesitation, a fear, as if he knew something he wasn't saying. Finch pressed him, but Arthur never gave in. He just kept repeating that he was in his room, that he hadn't heard anything, that he only found out about the disappearance when he came downstairs in the morning. The boys were taken to live with a distant aunt, a woman named Margaret, who lived in Bristol. She didn't want them, but she was family, and in those days, family meant obligation. Arthur adapted. He started working as an apprentice in a factory. He stopped talking about his father. He stopped talking about that night. He buried it all, as so many do. William, however, couldn't. He carried it like an open wound. He talked about it whenever anyone asked, and even when no one asked. The other boys at school teased him. They called him crazy, a liar, but he didn't care, because he knew what he had seen, and that was all that mattered. Years passed. The case was closed. Thomas Hargrave was officially declared missing. His house was sold. His belongings were donated. His memory was forgotten, except by William, who never forgot, who never stopped talking, who became in the eyes of many a kind of curiosity, a man obsessed with an event that no one else wanted to remember. Until 1908. William was 21 years old. He worked as a clerk in a law office in Bristol. He lived alone in a small apartment above a bakery. He rarely saw Arthur. He rarely saw anyone. He had become quiet, reserved, the kind of man who goes unnoticed. But then one afternoon in March he sought out Sheriff Finch, who was still alive, retired, living in a small house on the outskirts of Thornbury. William knocked on the door. Finch recognized him immediately, even after so many years. He invited him in, offered him tea, and waited. William sat down. He looked at his hands, and then, for the first time in 12 years, he said something different. I lied. Finch said nothing. He just waited, and William continued. He hadn't lied on purpose. Not at first. He really believed what he had seen, because he was a child, because he was scared, because his brain had turned something terrible into something impossible, to protect him, to make sense of what didn't make sense. But now, he remembered, or thought he remembered. He wasn't sure. Memory is treacherous, especially after so long, but there was something different, something he had suppressed, something that was finally coming to the surface. That night, he hadn't seen his father walk through the door. He had seen his father open the door, slowly, without making a sound, and leave. But when William ran to the door seconds later, it was locked, from the inside, as if it had never been opened, as if it had all been an illusion. But it wasn't, because outside, standing in the darkness, was someone tall, someone William couldn't see clearly, just a silhouette, and a voice. The same voice he had heard whispering on the other side of the door, calling his father, calling him outside. And Thomas went, without hesitation, without looking back, as if he had been waiting for it, as if he knew this moment would come. William didn't say anything at the time, because he was afraid they would come after him too, afraid that voice would come back. So he made it up, or distorted it, or simply let his mind create a version that made more sense. A version in which his father disappeared magically, instead of simply walking out the door and never coming back. Finch heard everything. He wrote it all down, and then he asked the only thing that mattered: who was outside? William shook his head. He didn't know. He never knew. But he had a suspicion, a memory, from weeks before, of seeing that same figure standing outside the house, watching, waiting, and of seeing his father looking back, as if they already knew each other. Robert Finch died in 1912. He never officially reopened the case. There was no reason to. There was no evidence, just the belated confession of a man who, in the eyes of many, had never been trustworthy. But before he died, Finch wrote a letter to the local newspaper, a short letter, direct. In it, he said only one thing: that he believed William, not in the first version, but in the second, that Thomas Hargrave had not disappeared by magic. He had walked out the door and found someone on the other side. The letter was published, but it generated no interest. The world had changed. War was coming. People had other concerns. The Hargrave case was ancient history, dust, a village mystery that no one cared to solve anymore. Arthur Hargrave never commented publicly on William's new version, but in 1923 he gave a brief interview to a reporter from Bristol. In it, he said only that he didn't remember that night, that it had been a long time ago, that he preferred not to talk about it. But when the reporter insisted, Arthur paused, and then he said something that was recorded in the interview notes, something that was never explained. I heard the voice too, but I pretended I didn't. The reporter asked what he meant. Arthur didn't answer. He got up, he thanked him, and he left. He died in 1941, during a bombing raid on London. He never married, he never had children, and he never spoke about his father again. William lived until 1957. He spent the last years of his life in a small house in Bath, alone. He never married, he never had close friends, but he wrote a lot. He kept diaries, notebooks full of notes, attempts to reconstruct that night, to understand what had happened, to make sense of what would never make sense. After his death, the diaries were found by a distant niece. She donated them to the Gloucestershire County Archives, where they still remain, locked in a rusty metal box, available for consultation, but rarely consulted because the Hargrave case is not famous, it is not sensational, it has no solution, and people prefer mysteries that can be solved, or at least understood. But inside those diaries, there is something, a note, written in 1953, 4 years before William's death. He was 66 at the time, and he was reviewing everything, once again, trying to remember, trying to separate what was real from what was imagined. And then he wrote something he had never written before, something that changed everything. Again, he said that on that night, when the door opened, he saw the face of the person outside. For a second, just a second, but it was enough, and the face was familiar, very familiar. It was his father's face, not Thomas's, but William's grandfather's. Thomas's father, the original carpenter, the man who had died years before William was born. He had seen photos, he had heard descriptions, and that night, for a brief moment, he had seen that face. Older, worn, but unmistakable, or at least that's what he thought he had seen, because as he himself wrote, memory is a fragile thing. It changes, it adapts, it creates things that never existed, and it destroys things that were always there. So maybe he saw it, or maybe he made it up, or maybe he saw something so disturbing that his brain turned it into something familiar, to make it bearable. We don't know. We'll never know. Today, the house where Thomas Hargrave disappeared still stands, but it's empty, abandoned. The windows are broken. The front door is torn off. The wind blows freely through it. It carries dry leaves, dust, pieces of old paper. The kitchen is still there. The table is still there, or at least what's left of it. And if you go there on an autumn night, when the fog rises from the fields and the wind whispers through the trees, you can feel it, that feeling that something happened there. Something that shouldn't have happened, something that left an invisible mark on the world. The residents of Thornbury don't talk much about the case. Most don't even know it ever happened. It's ancient history, buried under layers of time. But there are some, the older ones, those who still remember the stories told by their grandparents. And they say that sometimes at night, someone sees a light in the abandoned house, a faint light, orange, like an oil lamp. And that if you get close enough, you can hear it. A low sound, a murmur, coming from inside or outside. Impossible to tell, but no one gets close enough, because everyone knows. Some doors should not be opened, some questions should not be asked, and some mysteries should remain exactly where they are. In silence, in darkness, in the place where memory ends and the impossible begins. Thomas Hargrave disappeared on October 28, 1896. His son spent his entire life trying to understand what happened, and he never did. Maybe because there was nothing to understand. Maybe because some things just happen, without reason, without logic, without meaning. Or maybe because the truth, whatever it was so disturbing that even William couldn't accept it. And now, more than a century later, all that remains is a story, a witness who changed his mind, and a door that, on that night, may or may not have been opened, but which, one way or another, let a man pass through and never brought him back.